The morning light over Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport had that particular quality it always did in early autumn, thin and pale, stretched across the terminal windows like something uncertain of its own warmth. Thousands of people moved through the concourse in that purposeful blur that defined airport life. Rolling luggage, coffee cups, boarding passes gripped between fingers. Gate agents leaned over their podiums. Overhead announcements bounced off the polished floors. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a woman named Angela moved quietly through the crowd, drawing no particular attention to herself, or so she believed. She was 62 years old, though she carried her age the way a river carries stones smoothed down, unhurried, without complaint. She wore a pair of dark slacks she had owned for years, and a soft cream blouse, modest and clean. Her shoes were sensible flats, slightly scuffed at the toes. Over her shoulder, she carried a large canvas tote bag, the kind sold at grocery stores for $1.99, its handles worn soft from years of use. She had her reading glasses folded into the front pocket of the bag, a paperback novel, a small zippered pouch with her travel documents, and a thermos of tea she had brewed herself that morning before leaving the house. She did not carry designer luggage. She did not carry a branded handbag. She did not wear jewelry beyond a simple gold band on her right hand that had belonged to her mother. To anyone watching, Angela looked exactly like what she appeared to be, a woman of modest means, traveling alone, unbothered by the world around her. She approached the business class check-in counter with the same unhurried steadiness she brought to everything. The line was short, 2 businessmen ahead of her, both in sharp suits, both staring at their phones. The counter was staffed by 2 agents, a young woman named Brittany with a blonde ponytail pulled tight, and a man in his late 20s named Derek, who had the habit of looking at passengers the way a customs officer looks at a suspicious suitcase. Angela set her tote bag on the floor beside her and waited her turn. She was not impatient. She never was. Brittany noticed her first. It was a quick glance, the kind people think goes unobserved, a sweep from the canvas tote to the scuffed flats to the modest blouse. Something shifted in Brittany's expression, subtle but unmistakable. She turned slightly toward Derek and murmured something. Derek looked up, located Angela with his eyes, and the corner of his mouth moved. Neither of them said anything loud enough to be heard, but the 2 businessmen ahead of Angela had both moved on by the time she stepped forward, and the energy at the counter had already changed. "Can I help you?" Brittany asked, and the words themselves were perfectly professional. It was the tone underneath them, the barely there flatness, the absence of the warmth she had extended to the suited men that told the story. Angela placed her travel documents on the counter and smiled pleasantly. "Good morning. I'm checking in for the 9:15 to New York, business class." Brittany picked up the documents without returning the smile. Derek leaned slightly in her direction. Angela waited. Around her, the morning airport hummed and moved. A child ran past pulling a wheeled backpack shaped like a turtle. An announcement called a final boarding for Gate C14. Angela folded her hands in front of her and waited, her expression open and unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. Brittany's fingers stilled on the keyboard. She looked at the screen. She looked at Angela. She looked at the screen again. "Ma'am," she said slowly, "can I ask, is this your booking?" Angela blinked. "Of course. The confirmation number is right there on the itinerary." Brittany tilted her head in a way that managed to communicate both skepticism and condescension without a single additional word. "It's just," she began, and then appeared to think better of finishing the sentence. Instead, she turned to Derek and said something in a low voice. Derek nodded and picked up a phone receiver. Angela watched all of this with steady brown eyes. She said nothing. She had lived long enough to recognize what was happening, and she had learned long ago that the most powerful thing she could do in such moments was to remain exactly as she was, calm, clear, and immovable. "Ma'am," Brittany said at last, her voice carrying a practiced regret that reached about as deep as a coat of paint, "there seems to be a problem with your reservation. I'm going to need you to step to the side while we sort this out." The supervisor arrived within 3 minutes. His name was Gary, early 40s, heavyset, with the particular confidence of a man accustomed to being the largest authority in any given room. He looked at Angela with eyes that moved quickly, professionally, and landed on conclusions almost before they had traveled the full distance of observation. He smiled, but the smile was the kind designed to preempt argument rather than invite it. "Ma'am, I understand there may be some confusion about your booking," he said, and his voice had that managed calm quality that airport staff cultivated over years of handling difficult situations. Angela looked at him evenly. "There's no confusion on my end," she said. "I have a confirmed business class seat on the 9:15. Here is my confirmation, my government-issued identification, and my boarding pass as generated by the airline's own website." She produced each item with quiet precision. Gary took them, examined them, and did not look satisfied in the way a person looks when a problem has been resolved. He looked satisfied in the way a person looks when they believe they have already reached a conclusion and are merely gathering evidence to support it. A flight attendant named Cassandra had drifted over from the nearby gate, ostensibly to check something at the podium, though there was nothing at the podium that required checking. She was tall, polished, with dark hair and a uniform pressed to a crease that could have split paper. She looked at Angela with the kind of open curiosity that didn't bother to disguise itself. "Everything okay over here?" she asked Gary, though her eyes stayed on Angela. Gary made a small gesture that suggested the matter was complicated. Cassandra looked at the canvas tote bag. She looked at the scuffed flats. And then, in a voice low enough that she probably believed only Gary could hear it, though it carried, as voices in quiet terminal spaces always do, she said, "Maybe she got turned around. Economy is the next counter over." Someone in the small cluster of waiting passengers at the adjacent gate laughed. It was a short sound, quickly stifled, but it was there. Angela heard it. She did not look in the direction it came from. She looked at Gary and said, with a composure so complete it was almost its own kind of eloquence, "I would like my documents returned and my boarding pass issued, please." Gary handed back her documents, but did not issue a boarding pass. Instead, he cleared his throat and said that he had concerns about the validity of the booking and that he was going to need to escalate the verification process. He said it like it meant something official. What it meant, in practice, was that Angela was being held at the counter, while everyone around her decided what to do about a woman who looked, to their eyes, like she had wandered into the wrong line. It had not always been easy, the life Angela had built. She was a woman who knew the weight of difficulty, the way a farmer knows the weight of soil, not as a burden to complain about, but as the substance through which everything worthwhile grew. She had raised Marcus alone after his father left, when the boy was 4 years old. She had worked 2 jobs through his childhood, mornings at a dry cleaning business downtown, evenings answering phones at a hotel reservation center. She had moved them from a 2-room apartment in the part of the city where the streetlights were always half broken to a small house on a quiet street, and she had done it dollar by dollar, year by year, without drama and without shortcuts. Marcus had watched all of it. He had sat at kitchen tables where the homework was spread under a single lamp because good light cost money, and he had absorbed his mother's particular philosophy of living the way children absorb everything that matters, not through instruction, but through sustained, daily example. She had never cared about appearance, not in the vain sense, not in the status sense. She wore what was clean and comfortable. She drove a car that ran reliably. She bought furniture that lasted. She had told Marcus, more times than either of them could count, that a person's worth was not a number on a price tag, and that anyone who believed otherwise was confusing the map for the territory. When Marcus's career had taken off first the operations role, then the executive track, then the extraordinary thing that had happened 5 years ago, when he had been named Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Airways at the age of 38, she had attended the press announcement in that same, quiet, unhurried way. She attended everything. She had worn a navy dress she had owned for a decade. She had shaken hands. She had eaten a small piece of the celebratory cake. And on the drive home she had said to Marcus, "You remember that the chair doesn't make the person makes the chair." He had laughed and told her she was impossible. She had told him she was consistent. This morning, she had insisted on traveling without an escort or any special accommodation. Marcus had offered to have someone meet her, to arrange private lounge access, to flag her reservation with priority handling. She had declined all of it. "I'm taking a plane," she had said over the phone, "not launching a spacecraft." She had a meeting with her book club's sister chapter in New York, And then she planned to spend 3 days with her cousin in Brooklyn, and none of that required ceremony. What she did not know, as she stood at the counter in her cream blouse and her scuffed flats while Gary made phone calls, and Cassandra murmured to Brittany at the far end of the podium, was that her arrival had already registered on a different screen entirely. 41 floors above street level, in the glass and steel tower that served as Meridian Airways corporate headquarters 4 miles from the airport, Marcus Webb sat at the head of a conference table with 3 members of his operations team and a customer experience analyst named Priya, who had been walking him through the airline's new real-time service monitoring dashboard. The system was new. Marcus had pushed for it himself, a direct response to complaints about inconsistent service quality across the airline's domestic network. It pulled live feeds from customer interaction points across all Meridian hubs and flagged anomalies in service patterns. Priya had been demonstrating its alert functions when a yellow flag appeared on the Atlanta departure terminal feed, a business class check-in disruption. Duration already over 4 minutes. Priya had started to move past it. Yellow flags were common, usually resolving in under a minute, but something made Marcus say, "Pull that up." She had clicked through to He recognized her immediately. He would have recognized her in any light, at any distance, in any context, the particular way she held herself, the set of her shoulders, the tilt of her chin. He had been watching that posture his entire life. He knew it the way he knew his own reflection. Angela Webb, his mother, standing at a business-class check-in counter in her grocery store tote bag and her cream blouse, surrounded by airline employees who were treating her like a problem to be managed rather than a passenger to be served. Marcus did not move for a long moment. The conference room around him continued at its ordinary pace, Priya tapping something on her tablet, someone refilling their coffee, and he sat in the center of it with a stillness that had nothing to do with calm. He watched the screen. He watched Gary place a phone call. He watched Cassandra lean toward Brittany and say something that made Brittany smile slightly. He watched a passenger at the adjacent gate laugh at something. He watched his mother stand there, with her hands folded in front of her, and her expression as even and open as still water, giving nothing away. He felt something move through him that he did not immediately have a name for. It was not simply anger, though anger was part of it. It was something older and more precise, a recognition, sharp and cold, of what it meant to be seen as less than you were by people who had decided the answer before asking the question. He did not pick up the phone. Not yet. He had spent enough years in boardrooms to know the value of complete information, and he wanted to see this fully before he acted. He told Priya quietly to flag the recording for security preservation. He asked 2 members of the operations team to excuse themselves and wait outside. Then he pulled the camera feed onto the larger screen and watched. There was a discipline in this, a practiced restraint that Marcus had developed over years of managing crises in rooms full of people who wanted him to react before he had all the facts. Reacting was easy, understanding was hard. He had learned that the decisions made in the first 30 seconds of shock were almost always the ones you spent the following months repairing. So he sat. He watched. He let the full picture develop. The detail that stayed with him, that he would return to later, in the car, on the way back to the office, and again that night, and again. The following morning was not the moment Cassandra made her comment about the economy counter, though that was bad enough. It was the moment immediately after when a small cluster of nearby passengers smiled, not cruelly, not with any obvious malice. They smiled the way people smile when something confirms what they already believed, an easy, automatic, socially affirmed smile, the kind that requires no thought because no thought has been applied. That smile, Marcus understood, was the real problem, not just one woman with a mean streak, not just a supervisor with poor judgment, an entire small ecosystem of assumption, so normalized that it could generate laughter from strangers before a single fact had been established. He thought about how many times, at how many gates, in how many airports, this same ecosystem had operated without a recording and without a CEO watching a monitor 4 miles away. He thought about all the Angelas who had stepped aside and accepted the economy pass and said nothing, because they had learned, as his mother had learned, that making a scene cost more than the injustice it addressed. This was the calculation that cruelty depended on, and it made him very, very still. Angela had been asked to step aside from the counter twice now. Each time she had complied without protest, though she had also made it clear, in her precise and unhurried way, that she considered the delay both unnecessary and without legitimate basis. Gary had consulted with two other staff members. Cassandra had made a production of reviewing something on a tablet that Marcus could see from the camera angle contained nothing relevant to the situation. Brittany had answered the counter for two other business-class passengers in the interim, greeting both with the warmth and efficiency she had withheld from Angela. And then, in what Marcus would later describe to his legal team as the moment that sealed every subsequent decision, Cassandra turned to the handful of nearby passengers who had been watching the situation develop and said, clearly, and without apparent embarrassment, "She doesn't look like she belongs in business class." She said it with a small, conspiratorial smile, the kind that invites a shared understanding. Two of the passengers smiled back. One looked uncomfortable and looked away. Angela, standing 8 feet from Cassandra, heard every word. She looked at Cassandra for a moment, with an expression that was not wounded and not angry, but simply clear the expression of someone who has seen this before and knows exactly what it is. Then she looked back at Gary and said, "I would appreciate a resolution to this matter." Gary told her that the system was indicating a verification issue and that the most efficient path forward was to accept a seat in economy class for this flight with a full refund of the business class fare to follow. He said it with the practiced sympathy of a man who has calculated that looking sorry is cheaper than being wrong. Angela looked at him. "You are asking me to accept a downgrade I have not requested, did not earn, and do not deserve, based on a verification issue that exists only in your system's flag and not in my confirmed reservation." Gary told her he understood her frustration. She told him she was not frustrated. She was factually correct. The distinction, she said, was important. In the end, it didn't matter. Gary had authority over the gate, and Gary, having committed to a position in front of his staff and a handful of passengers, did what people do when the cost of being right feels lower than the cost of reversing course in public. He issued the economy boarding pass. He had Angela's carry-on bag relocated. He told her a customer service representative would follow up about the refund. And Angela, because she was not someone who made scenes, because she had learned that dignity required no audience and no validation, walked to the economy section of the gate with her canvas tote bag on her shoulder and her thermos of tea in her hand, and took her seat. Around her, the morning continued. Gates announced their departures. Children cried and were comforted. The machine of the airport moved at its own indifferent pace. She found herself seated next to a man in his mid-40s named Terrence, a high school history teacher from Decatur traveling to New York for a conference. He had the open face of a man who genuinely liked people, and the easy manner of someone who spent his days in rooms full of teenagers, and had learned to read a room quickly. He noticed Angela, noticed the quiet dignity she carried, and made no comment about how she had come to be in seat 34C when her boarding pass looked like it had been recently printed, rather than generated, at home. He simply said good morning and offered her half of the granola bar he had in his jacket pocket, which she declined with a smile. They talked for a little while about New York, about the weather, about a book she was reading. She did not tell him who she was. She did not tell him anything about the past hour, except that the check-in had been complicated, which made him nod in the particular way of a man who has navigated many complicated check-ins and knows there is sometimes nothing more to say. She liked him immediately. She liked his ordinariness and his kindness, and the way he did not seem to require explanation from her. He had a quality she recognized and valued. He looked at her and saw a person rather than a category. It was not a remarkable quality, she knew. It should not have been remarkable. And yet, that morning, it felt like something worth noting. At the gate, Cassandra had taken up her position near the jetway door. The flight was in its final boarding phase. Economy passengers filed through in the usual compressed stream. Brittany was closing out the business class manifest. Gary stood a short distance away, satisfied in the specific way of a man who has dealt with a complication. He did not think about Angela anymore. He thought about his lunch break and whether the deli near the employee lounge had the turkey sandwich today. The plane's door was 12 minutes from closing, and then Gary's radio crackled. The message that came through was brief and used the terminology that Meridian Airways reserved for communications that were not optional. It came from the airline's operations center, and it referenced a priority protocol, a code word that Gary had heard used exactly twice in his 11 years with the company. Both times, under circumstances he still discussed at dinner parties. His face changed. He looked at his radio. He looked at Brittany. He looked at the jetway. He picked up his radio and requested clarification. Clarification arrived in the form of a second message from a different channel, this one from the airport's senior operations director, and it said 4 words: "Hold the aircraft now." The flight to New York did not close its door at the scheduled time. The captain, a 20-year veteran named Harrison, who had received his instruction 3 minutes before scheduled departure via the pilot communications channel, had made the announcement that there would be a brief delay for operational reasons. Operational reasons. It was the phrase that covered everything from a mechanical check to a missing cargo manifest, and passengers accepted it with the resigned familiarity of people who have learned that airports operate on their own logic. In the economy section, Terrence looked at his watch and said something philosophical about delays. Angela looked out the window at the tarmac and said nothing. Her expression, to anyone watching closely, was not worried. It was almost composed in a different way than it had been at the check-in counter, as if something had shifted in the atmosphere and she could feel it, though she said nothing and asked nothing. She simply waited. Gary was told to report to Gate B7 with his shift supervisor and 2 members of the ground crew. He did not know why. His shift supervisor, a woman named Donna, who had been with Meridian for 19 years and who had a sixth sense for institutional trouble, looked at his face when he told her and said quietly, "What did you do?" Gary said he hadn't done anything. Donna said that Gate B7 was not a gate that generated priority holds for nothing, and that they should walk quickly. They walked quickly. Cassandra, who had been told to remain at the gate, stood near the podium with the particular tension of someone who is waiting to find out what they already suspect. Brittany organized papers that did not need organizing. The gate area had that specific held-breath quality of a room where everyone knows something is about to happen, but no one yet knows what. The delegation appeared from the B concourse corridor. There were 5 of them, 2 men from the operations center in their Meridian jackets, the airport's senior director of ground operations, a woman in corporate attire, who carried a tablet and moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to being wherever decisions were made. And in the center of the group, moving with a quietness that was its own kind of presence, Marcus Webb. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, and lean in the way of a man who had grown up doing physical work. He wore a dark suit with no tie, and Meridian Airways pin on his lapel, and the expression of a man who had made many decisions in many rooms and had long since stopped worrying about whether the decisions made him popular. He was recognized before he reached the gate. A passenger waiting near the window pulled out a phone. 2 airline employees near the podium went still. Gary, who had met the CEO exactly once at an all-hands meeting 2 years prior, felt the specific gravity of the moment before he fully understood it. Donna, beside him, said nothing. Her jaw was very still. Marcus did not stop to speak to anyone. He walked through the gate door and down the jetway. The cabin went quiet in that incremental way that a large space goes quiet, not all at once, but in a wave. Flight attendants in the forward galley exchanged a look. A passenger in business class said something to his seatmate, and both craned to look toward the back of the plane. Marcus walked down the aisle without hurrying, without looking to the left or right, without stopping. He passed the business class section. He passed the first rows of economy. He continued until he was standing in the row where Terrence was looking at him with the uncertain expression of a man who is not sure whether something wonderful or terrible is about to happen, and where Angela, who had turned from the window at the change in the cabin's atmosphere, was looking up at him with those brown eyes that had watched him his entire life. Marcus stopped. He crouched down slightly to her eye level, ignoring everything and everyone around him. The watching cabin, the held breath, the flight attendants frozen in the aisle, Terrence going absolutely rigid in the next seat. He looked at his mother, and he said, in a voice that was quiet but carried in the stillness, "Mom." The word had a particular quality when spoken in that silence. It was not a dramatic word. It was one of the oldest and most ordinary words in the language. But in the context of that moment, the CEO of the airline, kneeling in the aisle of the economy section, addressing the woman in seat 34C in her cream blouse and canvas tote bag, it carried a weight that the word itself was not designed to bear and bore anyway, because that is what the right word in the right moment does. Angela looked at her son for a moment. Then she said, "You didn't have to come." He said, "Yes, I did." She reached up and adjusted the collar of his suit jacket in the way mothers adjust things that don't need adjusting, and he let her. Around them, the cabin began to process what it was seeing. Marcus stood and turned to face the aisle. He did not raise his voice. He had learned long ago that volume and authority were unrelated, that the quieter a person spoke in certain moments, the more completely they were heard. He introduced himself not with his title, simply with his name, and said that the flight had been briefly delayed to address a matter that the airline needed to handle with transparency. He had, he said, spent the last 40 minutes watching footage from the terminal that had been recorded by the airline's own surveillance system. He had watched his mother present a valid confirmed ticket, a valid government-issued identification, and a valid boarding pass, and he had watched a series of airline employees decline to honor any of it. He had watched her be asked to step aside, questioned about the legitimacy of her reservation, subjected to commentary about her appearance that was recorded on the airline's cameras, and ultimately removed from a seat she had paid for in full and given every right to occupy. He said all of this in the same quiet, level tone, looking at nothing in particular, speaking to the whole cabin and to no one individual. He then reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and removed a small device, a phone, connected to the cabin's display system via the operations coordinator who had followed him onto the plane. And on the seatback screens in the rows surrounding them, a segment of footage appeared. It was perhaps 90 seconds in total. It showed the check-in counter. It showed Angela arriving. It showed the look that passed between Brittany and Derek. It showed Gary's managed expressions. It showed Cassandra's comment, audible and clear, about the economy counter. It showed the moment Cassandra turned to nearby passengers and said, without embarrassment, that Angela did not look like she belonged. It showed Angela's response calm, precise, undramatic. It showed the economy boarding pass being issued. The cabin was completely silent. A woman in the fourth row of economy pressed her hand over her mouth. A man in business class stared at the screen in front of him with an expression that suggested he was recalibrating something. Terrence, in the seat next to Angela, sat very still with his hands in his lap. Angela herself did not look at the screens. She looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap, and her expression was not triumphant and not wounded and not angry. It was the expression of a woman who has seen something confirmed that she already knew, and who does not find the confirmation satisfying. There is no pleasure in being right about the worst things. Marcus turned off the footage. He looked out at the cabin for a moment. Then he said, "I want to ask the people who participated in what you just watched a question. If this woman were not my mother, if she were simply a passenger with a confirmed ticket and a valid reservation, would what happened this morning be acceptable?" He let the silence answer. No one spoke. "I didn't think so," he said. He looked toward the front of the plane, where Gary and Donna had followed the operations team onto the aircraft, and were standing near the forward galley, Gary with the color of a man who has just understood fully what he has done. Cassandra was behind him. Brittany further back. Marcus did not raise his voice. He said, "I'll speak to each of you individually at the gate." He did not say anything else to them. He turned back to his mother. "Would you like to move to your actual seat?" he asked her. Angela looked at him. She looked at Terrence, who gave her a small, genuine smile, and said, "Go on." She gathered her tote bag and her thermos and stood, and Marcus held out his hand in the old-fashioned way, which she took with the manner of a woman accepting what was simply correct rather than what was exceptional. They walked together to the front of the plane, and every set of eyes in the cabin followed them. No one spoke. No one looked at their phones. The plane held its breath. When they reached the business class section, Marcus saw her to her seat, the window seat, 30A, the one listed on her original boarding pass, and made sure the flight attendant brought her a proper welcome. He said nothing performative. He did not address the cabin again. He simply saw his mother to her seat, said something quiet that made her shake her head, and then laugh slightly. And then he turned and walked back up the jetway. At the gate, the reckoning was swift and without theater. Marcus conducted it the way he conducted difficult things directly, without excessive ceremony, and with a precision that left no room for misinterpretation. Gary was placed on immediate administrative suspension, pending a full review. Cassandra was suspended. Brittany was suspended. The shift supervisor of the ground crew was placed under notice for a formal review of team management failures. Marcus spoke to each of them briefly and individually, not to humiliate them, but to make clear that there was a gap between what the airline's values required and what they had done that morning, and that the gap would be examined thoroughly. Gary said that he had been trying to follow protocol. Marcus said that protocol did not require contempt, and that the two should not be confused. Cassandra said nothing at all. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her and her eyes on the middle distance, and Marcus looked at her for a moment and said that silence was an appropriate response to what she was likely feeling right now, and that he hoped she would find better words in time. He also made a call to the airline's head of training and development and told her that the incident would be used as the basis for a mandatory system-wide retraining program on equitable service standards. He did not ask her if this was feasible. He told her when it needed to begin. He made another call to the airline's communications director, and then he did something that surprised the operations coordinator. Standing next to him, he put his phone in his pocket and stood quietly for a moment, in the emptying gate area, looking out at the tarmac, and breathed. One of the ground operations staff, a young woman who had been at the edge of the situation and had not participated but had also not intervened, came to him and said carefully that she was sorry she hadn't said something. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Saying something is always an option. It's always hard, and it's always available." She nodded. He said, "Remember that." He didn't say it harshly. He said it the way his mother would have said it. On the plane, Angela had accepted a cup of tea. The flight attendant had asked if she would prefer coffee or tea, and the specific care in the asking had been notable, though Angela had not commented on it. She had opened her paperback novel. Terence was in his economy seat 2/3 of the way back, and she thought about him, about his easy manner and his granola bar and his good faith, and she thought she would find him after the flight and give him her contact information, because the world needed more people like Terence, and those people deserved to be acknowledged. She thought about the passengers who had laughed at the gate, and she thought about them without bitterness, because bitterness was a thing that required ongoing investment, and she had never had the interest. She had learned this the hard way, the way most worthwhile things are learned through years of practice and through watching what bitterness did to people who fed it. She had known women who had let the weight of every injustice compound and calcify until there was almost nothing left of them that was not grievance. She understood the origin of that. She did not judge it. But she had chosen differently, not because the injustices had been smaller or less real, but because she had decided a long time ago that her life was the primary thing she was responsible for, and that whatever she allowed to live in the center of it would eventually determine its shape. She thought about Gary and Cassandra and Brittany, and she hoped that what had happened to them today, the loss of their positions, the exposure of their conduct, might be the kind of difficulty that eventually teaches something. She was not confident of it, but she hoped. Captain Harrison made his pre-departure announcement in the practiced, unhurried cadence of a man who has been speaking into aircraft intercoms for 2 decades. He said they had been cleared for departure and that the flight time to New York would be approximately 2 hours and 14 minutes. He did not reference the delay. He said he hoped passengers had a comfortable flight and that the crew would be available for anything they needed. The jetway detached with its customary thud. The plane began to move. In the cabin, a man in business class, row 2, turned to the woman beside him and said something under his breath. She nodded. In the economy section, a passenger who had witnessed part of the gate area incident through the window said to the person next to her that she couldn't believe what she'd seen, and the person next to her said they believed it completely because they'd seen things like it before, and then they were both quiet, because there was a particular kind of grief in recognizing something as common that should be rare. Terence put on his headphones and looked out the window at the city falling away below them, and thought about his lesson plans, and thought about what he might tell his students about what he'd witnessed, because he taught history. And he understood that history happened in small moments, as much as in large ones at lunch counters and bus seats and check-in desks, in the accumulated weight of ordinary days. He thought about the faces of his students, many of whom had grown up carrying the same knowledge. Angela carried the knowledge of what it felt like to be measured and found wanting, before you had spoken a word, and he thought about what it meant to be able to tell them that dignity was not only possible to maintain under those conditions, but was, in fact, the most powerful thing a person could hold. He thought he might not use names. He might not need to. The shape of the story was enough. Marcus was back in his car before the plane lifted off. He watched the departure on his phone's flight tracking app, the blue icon of the aircraft lifting off the tarmac and arcing northward. He thought about his mother at age 30, working the evening reservation desk, her voice professionally warm even when the callers were rude, her expression never betraying the weight of a day that had started before dawn and would not end until after his bedtime. He thought about the kitchen table and the single lamp and the homework. He thought about the things she had said to him the morning of his CEO announcement, the thing about the chair not making the person, which he had laughed at, but which he had also, in the years since, returned to more times than he could count. He thought about what it meant to have built a company with several thousand employees, and to have discovered, on a Tuesday morning in October, that the values he thought he had instilled in that company were not present in the room where they were most needed. He thought about the young woman at the gate, who said she was sorry she hadn't spoken up. He thought about what it cost to speak up and what it cost not to. He opened his laptop in the back of the car and began drafting the all-staff message himself. He did not hand it to communications. He wrote it himself, in the plain language that he preferred, and that his mother had always modeled for him. No corporate euphemisms, no strategic positioning, simply what had happened, and what it meant, and what would follow. He wrote that an incident had occurred that morning at their Atlanta hub. He wrote that it had involved a passenger being subjected to treatment that was discriminatory, dismissive, and inconsistent with every stated value of the organization. He wrote that the passenger happened to be a person connected to him personally, and he wrote that he wanted to be clear that this mattered not because of that connection, but because it would have been equally wrong if she had been a complete stranger, which was precisely the point. He wrote that the question he had asked on the plane was the question he wanted every employee of the airline to carry with them. If there were no personal connection, if there were no consequence, if no one were watching, would what you were about to do be right? He wrote that this question was not a new one, and not a complicated one, but that it was one they had to answer freshly every single day. He read it over once. He sent it. Then he sat for a moment in the back of the car, as the Atlanta streets moved past the window, and thought about the version of this morning where no camera had flagged the incident, where no alert had appeared on the dashboard, where he had sat in his conference room reviewing quarterly numbers while his mother rode 3 hours in an economy seat because 3 airline employees had looked at her face and her tote bag and decided, in the space of a few seconds, that she was not worth their best. He thought about how close that version had been to the version that happened. He thought about the systems and the cameras and the dashboards and understood that none of them were the real answer, that the real answer lived in the individual human moment, in the space between a first glance and the first word, in the small choice to look more carefully at a person before you look away. The plane carrying Angela Webb to New York was somewhere over the Carolinas by the time he sent it. At 35,000 feet, in seat 30A by the window, Angela had made meaningful progress in her novel and had finished her thermos of tea and was looking out at the cloud cover below with the quiet attentiveness she brought to most things. The flight attendant had brought her a warm breakfast without being asked, and she had thanked him sincerely and eaten most of it. The business class section around her had the particular quality of a group of people who had all witnessed something extraordinary and had decided, by unspoken agreement, not to discuss it directly, but to exist alongside it, aware of its weight in the shared air. Angela was comfortable with this. She had no need to discuss it. The morning had been what it had been, and it was already behind her, and New York was ahead, and her cousin was expecting her Thursday, and the book club, in the city, had chosen a novel she was genuinely curious about. She had said one thing to Marcus, quietly, when he stood to leave her at her seat. She had put her hand on his arm and said, "Don't be too hard on them." He had looked at her. "Mom," he had said. "I know," she had replied. "But remember that most cruelty is a failure of imagination. They couldn't imagine that I was anything other than what I looked like. The cure for that is not punishment alone. It's expansion." He had looked at her for a moment with the expression he had worn since childhood, when she said things that he needed time to fully enter a stillness in his face, a slight narrowing of the eyes, as if he were filing the words somewhere internal for later retrieval, which was always what he did with the things she said that mattered most. She had watched him do this since he was 6 years old, this particular filing expression, and it never failed to move her. She had raised a person who listened. In a world that generated noise at industrial scale, she had raised a person who actually stopped and heard. That was not an accident. That was 30 years of kitchen table conversations, of asking him at the end of every school day, not what happened, but what he noticed, of insisting that the space between event and response was the most important space a person could learn to inhabit. Then he had said, "You're going to have to explain that to me over the phone tonight." She had said, "I will." He had said, "I love you, Mom." She had said, "I know that too." And she had meant it absolutely, without performance, without qualification, the way she meant everything she said, which was the only way she had ever learned to say things at all. There is a kind of wealth that does not photograph well. It does not present itself in first-class lounges or designer luggage or the confident posture of someone accustomed to being recognized. It sits quietly in coach seats, when asked to, and does not make scenes. It drinks homemade tea from a grocery store thermos. It reads paperback novels with bent spines. It adjusts the collars of expensive suit jackets with the same hands that once ironed discount store school uniforms on Saturday nights, so that a small boy could go to class on Monday morning looking, in at least this one small way, like the person she had always known he was going to become. This kind of wealth is not passive. It is not resignation or weakness or lack of self-knowledge. It is, if anything, the most rigorous self-knowledge there is the knowledge of one's own value, that does not require external confirmation, that does not shift when other people's eyes make their calculations, that remains exactly and completely itself, regardless of what it is wearing or carrying or where it has been told to sit. Angela Webb had spent 62 years accumulating this kind of wealth. She was, in the truest sense, one of the richest people on that plane. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that the people at the check-in counter had failed entirely to perceive, was that she would have been exactly this rich if her son had been a bus driver, a school teacher, a man who fixed appliances for a living. The wealth was hers. It had always been hers. It had nothing to do with Marcus and everything to do with the woman she had chosen, day after day for 6 decades, to be. The clouds below were brilliant white in the morning sun. Angela turned a page of her novel. Below her, in cities and suburbs, and airports and offices, people were making small decisions about how to treat each other, decisions shaped by assumption and appearance, and every quick calculation the mind performs before it has time to ask whether the calculation is just. Most of those decisions would never be recorded. Most of them would never be examined. Most of them would simply become the texture of someone's day, for better or worse, and pass unremarked into the great invisible ledger of ordinary human interaction that none of us will ever fully see or account for. But some of them, the ones made in the rare moments, when a person slows down enough to ask the real question, the one Marcus had asked on the aircraft, the one his mother had been living for 6 decades, some of those decisions became something else. They became the small, irreversible choices that determine what a person or a company or a world actually is beneath everything it wears. The true measure of a person is never what they carry. It is never what they're wearing, or where they're seated, or how new their luggage looks, or what kind of bag they've put their travel documents into. The true measure is what remains of their dignity when someone has done their level best to take it, and what they choose to do next. Angela already knew this. She had known it for a very long time, and on a clear autumn morning, at 35,000 feet, flying first class to New York, in a seat she had never needed anyone's permission to occupy, She turned another page and kept reading.